What if there was a single moment when the world humanity had known for thousands of years quietly began to vanish? Entire coastlines disappeared beneath rising seas. Great grasslands turned into forests. Ancient animals faded away, and the first civilizations emerged from the shadows of a changing earth. Tonight we're travelling back to the day the old world began to disappear, and uncovering how that forgotten transformation shaped every life that followed. Before we begin, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and join us as we explore history's greatest lost world. The first sign is almost impossible to notice. A shoreline sits a little farther inland than it did within living memory. A familiar spring runs weak through the hottest weeks of the year. Hunters who once followed migrating herds across open grassland discover marshes where dry ground used to be. Fishermen return with stories that reefs have vanished beneath deeper water. Farmers wait for rains that arrive later than expected, or arrive all at once with unusual force. No one standing in that moment believes they are witnessing the beginning of the disappearance of an entire world. Yet this is how immense historical transformations often begin, not with a single catastrophe, but with countless small changes that appear ordinary until viewed across generations. Long before maps define continents with neat borders, and before historians assign names to kingdoms and empires, people already inhabit landscapes that seem permanent. Rivers carve dependable routes through broad valleys. Forests cover hills that have been wooded for thousands of years. Fertile plains support villages whose inhabitants assume their grandchildren will inherit the same fields. Along coastlines stretching from the Atlantic to the Eastern Mediterranean, from the Persian Gulf to the South China Sea, communities build lives around rhythms that appear timeless. The land itself becomes part of memory. Every hill, every bend in a river, every rocky outcrop carries stories older than the oldest living elder. Yet permanence is one of history's greatest illusions. The earth has never truly stood still. Mountains rise almost too slowly for human eyes to detect. Ice sheets expand and retreat over spans longer than civilizations. Oceans creep across coastlines centimetre by centimetre, until after centuries entire valleys disappear beneath the waves. Climate oscillates through cycles that transform forests into grasslands and fertile plains into deserts. What seems eternal during one lifetime may prove remarkably temporary across many centuries. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. To understand the day the old world began to disappear, it helps to imagine a world that feels astonishingly alive. Around 8,000 years ago, vast portions of what are now deserts support lakes filled with fish and surrounded by grasslands. The Sahara is not yet the immense expanse of sand familiar today. Instead, large regions contain rivers, wetlands, scattered woodlands, and abundant wildlife. Hippopotamuses wallow in freshwater pools. Crocodiles inhabit rivers flowing through landscapes now considered among the driest places on Earth. Human communities leave rock art depicting cattle, giraffes, elephants, and swimmers visual evidence that these landscapes once looked dramatically different. Farther north, Europe continues adjusting to the end of the last ice age. Great glaciers have mostly retreated, but the land itself still responds to the enormous weight that once pressed upon it. In Scandinavia, the ground slowly rises as the crust rebounds after millennia beneath thick ice. Elsewhere, rising seas quietly invade low-lying coastlines. Ancient forests occupy areas now hidden beneath cold northern waters. River valleys that once guide travellers eventually become submerged channels beneath modern seas. Across Western Asia, early farming communities flourish. Villages grow larger as agriculture provides increasingly reliable harvests. Wheat and barley spread across fertile valleys. Sheep, goats, cattle, and pigs become central to everyday life. Pottery improves. Trade expands between settlements separated by hundreds of kilometers. Obsidian from volcanic regions appears in distant communities, demonstrating that networks of exchange already stretch across surprisingly large distances. These societies are not primitive outposts waiting for civilization to begin. They represent sophisticated adaptations built upon generations of accumulated knowledge. To those living within them, this world appears stable. Children inherit the same farming techniques practiced by their parents. Seasonal festivals coincide with planting and harvest. Rivers flood often enough to enrich fields, but rarely enough to seem unpredictable. Fish migrate according to familiar cycles. Wild plants emerge during expected seasons. The stars cross the night sky with reassuring regularity. Daily existence depends upon patterns, and those patterns encourage confidence that tomorrow will resemble yesterday. What survives in the archaeological record suggests that many ancient communities possess remarkable environmental knowledge. They understand local animals, weather patterns, soils, and waterways with extraordinary precision. They know which valleys flood first after heavy rains and which hills retain moisture during drought. They recognize subtle seasonal signals invisible to outsiders. Their survival depends upon careful observation rather than written scientific explanation. Ironically, this intimate understanding also reveals something unsettling. The people closest to nature are often the first to recognize that familiar patterns are shifting. Perhaps fish arrive several weeks later than expected. Perhaps snow melts earlier in distant mountains, altering river flows. Perhaps a woodland gradually retreats uphill, while unfamiliar grasses expand across former forest edges. None of these changes alone announces the end of an age. They simply introduce uncertainty into routines that have endured for centuries. Modern climate science allows researchers to reconstruct many of these ancient environmental changes through remarkable methods unavailable even a generation ago. Tiny bubbles trapped inside Greenland and Antarctic ice preserve samples of ancient atmospheres. Layers of pollen buried within lake sediments reveal which plants dominate different periods. Tree rings record years of abundant rainfall and years of severe drought. Marine sediments preserve microscopic organisms whose chemistry reflects ancient ocean temperatures. Cave formations accumulate mineral layers that quietly record shifts in rainfall over thousands of years. Together, these independent records tell a consistent story. The ancient world is never static. Instead, it experiences continuous environmental fluctuations, some gradual enough for adaptation, others abrupt enough to challenge entire societies. Scholars still debate exactly how individual communities respond to these shifts because the evidence remains incomplete. Human choices never depend upon climate alone. Political organization, trade relationships, technological innovation, cultural traditions, and simple chance all influence survival. Two neighboring societies facing similar environmental pressures may experience entirely different outcomes. One adapts successfully, another fragments within only a few generations. No single explanation fully accounts for these differences. This complexity makes the disappearance of the old world more compelling rather than less. There is no single villain hidden within history, no lone volcano, no solitary drought, no individual invasion explains everything. Instead, countless forces gradually intertwine until the world inherited by one generation becomes almost unrecognizable to the next. Imagine standing upon a coastal bluff overlooking a settlement that has existed for hundreds of years. Children play near houses built by their grandparents. Fishing boats rest along a sheltered shore. Smoke rises gently into evening air. Nothing about the scene suggests that future archaeologists may one day search for this village beneath meters of seawater. Yet thousands of such places almost certainly vanish without leaving written records. Entire landscapes disappear so gradually that their memories survive only through scattered legends, submerged ruins, and fragments of stone hidden beneath sediment. The people living there cannot know they occupy one of history's thresholds. They simply continue repairing nets, tending livestock, harvesting grain, and raising families. Life always demands attention to immediate needs. Few societies pause long enough to recognize that they stand inside transformations visible only across centuries. Looking backward from the present, however, those quiet centuries reveal themselves as the beginning of one of humanity's greatest transitions. The familiar geography of the ancient world slowly starts dissolving. Coastlines shift, climates evolve, rivers change course. Some communities prosper through adaptation while others gradually fade into silence. Piece by piece, almost unnoticed by those living through it, the old world begins to disappear. The transformation begins so quietly that it seems less like a revolution than a change in habit. Winters lose a little of their familiar bite in one generation, only to become unexpectedly harsher several centuries later. Summer rains drift farther north, or arrive weeks later than remembered. Rivers that once overflow with dependable regularity become less predictable. A landscape does not announce that it's entering a new age. It simply behaves differently often enough that people slowly realize the old rules no longer apply. For thousands of years after the end of the last ice age, much of the northern hemisphere experiences what scientists call the Holocene climate optimum, a period during which many regions enjoy relatively warm and stable conditions. Forests expand into territories once dominated by tundra. Wetlands flourish across broad plains. Rainfall patterns support growing populations in places that had previously been far less hospitable. Human societies spread into landscapes that earlier generations would have found difficult to occupy. This stability becomes one of civilization's greatest allies. Agriculture depends not merely upon fertile soil but upon predictability. Seeds planted in spring must encounter familiar temperatures and expected rainfall. Livestock require grazing lands that return year after year. Villages become towns because harvests can be anticipated with reasonable confidence. Temples, granaries, roads, and irrigation canals represent enormous investments of labor that make sense only when people believe the surrounding environment will continue supporting them. For centuries, that confidence appears justified. Across the Fertile Crescent, farming communities multiply. In the Nile Valley, seasonal floods nourish fields with fresh layers of nutrient-rich silt. Across the Indus Basin, expanding settlements draw life from mighty rivers descending from distant mountains. In Eastern Asia, rice cultivation spreads through landscapes shaped by monsoon rains. Even regions that remain relatively dry often contain dependable springs, seasonal streams, or grasslands sufficient for pastoral societies. The climate does not create civilization by itself, but it provides the stage upon which civilization becomes possible. Yet Earth's climate system is never truly fixed. It is an immense web of interacting forces driven by solar energy, atmospheric circulation, ocean currents, volcanic activity, orbital variations, and countless natural feedbacks. Some changes unfold over tens of thousands of years. Others develop within only a few generations. Human beings rarely perceive these gradual transitions while living through them, because each generation accepts the environment of childhood as normal. Modern researchers refer to this tendency as shifting baseline syndrome. Every generation measures change against its own experience rather than against the deeper past. A farmer noticing slightly drier summers compares them with those remembered by parents and grandparents, not with conditions thousands of years earlier. This natural limitation means enormous transformations can unfold without appearing dramatic to those experiencing them. One of the most remarkable examples occurs across northern Africa. Today, the Sahara stretches across roughly 9 million square kilometers, forming the largest hot desert on Earth. Endless dunes, rocky plateaus, and gravel plains dominate the landscape. Rain falls so rarely across many regions that entire years pass without measurable precipitation. Several thousand years earlier, however, much of this immense territory looks astonishingly different. Satellite imagery reveals the ghostly traces of ancient river systems hidden beneath the sands. Dry lake beds appear where no permanent water exists today. Archaeologists uncover fishing harpoons hundreds of kilometers from modern coastlines. Fossil pollen preserved beneath desert sediments indicates widespread grasses, shrubs, and scattered trees. Rock paintings depict animals requiring abundant fresh water, including buffalo hippopotamuses, crocodiles, elephants, and antelope. The evidence from geology, archaeology, and paleoclimate research converges upon the same conclusion. Large portions of the Sahara once support ecosystems capable of sustaining both wildlife and substantial human populations. The reason lies partly in the rhythm of Earth's orbit. Our planet does not travel around the Sun in precisely the same orientation forever. Subtle variations in axial tilt and orbital wobble alter the seasonal distribution of sunlight over thousands of years. These slow astronomical cycles influence monsoon systems, strengthening them during some periods and weakening them during others. During the African humid period, stronger summer monsoons carry moisture deep into regions now almost completely arid. Eventually that balance begins changing. The weakening monsoon does not transform the Sahara into a desert overnight. Instead, lakes gradually shrink. Rivers flow less consistently. Grasslands retreat. Woodlands become fragmented. Communities depending upon abundant water face increasing uncertainty. Some adapt by moving toward more reliable sources of fresh water. Others alter their economies, relying more heavily upon livestock capable of surviving harsher conditions. Scholars still debate exactly how rapidly different parts of the Sahara dry, because local environments respond differently. Some lakes disappear relatively quickly. Other wetlands survive for centuries as isolated refuges. The evidence remains incomplete, but what survives in the geological record suggests a mosaic of changing landscapes rather than a single dramatic event. Similar stories unfold elsewhere. In parts of Europe, expanding forests alter hunting territories established over countless generations. Along Atlantic coastlines, rising sea levels continue swallowing ancient lowlands. In Western Asia, fluctuations in rainfall reshape the productivity of marginal farming regions. Even mountain glaciers continue adjusting to changing temperatures, influencing the rivers that nourish distant civilizations. No individual community fully understands the planetary scale of these transformations. Instead, each village experiences only its own local consequences. One settlement notices declining harvests. Another observes new marshes forming where dry meadows once existed. A fishing community discovers familiar breeding grounds shifting farther offshore. Herding families find traditional grazing routes becoming less dependable. None can see the wider pattern linking distant regions across continents. This limitation becomes one of history's defining characteristics. Civilizations rarely collapse because a single disaster strikes everywhere simultaneously. More often, numerous local pressure accumulate until societies become increasingly vulnerable. A sequence of poor harvests weakens food reserves. Population growth stretches available resources. Trade networks compensate for local shortages until those same networks begin experiencing problems of their own. Environmental stress alone does not determine the outcome, but it quietly increases the consequences of every political mistake, military conflict, or economic disruption. Climate acts less like a conqueror than like an invisible editor. It removes small margins of safety. Communities that once survive occasional drought now struggle through repeated dry years. Rivers that once tolerate modest engineering projects become less forgiving. Crops suited to older rainfall patterns produce diminishing returns. Every adjustment demands labor knowledge and cooperation. Some societies respond with remarkable resilience. Others gradually discover that the world supporting their ancestors no longer exists in quite the same form. Without realizing it, humanity is entering an age in which the landscapes inherited from the distant past begin surrendering to new realities. The change remains slow enough to seem almost invisible, yet powerful enough to redirect migrations, reshape economies, and alter the destiny of civilizations that have not yet reached their greatest heights. The sea rarely appears impatient. It advances without banners, without armies, without the sudden violence of an earthquake or the towering force of a volcanic eruption. It simply rises year after year, generation after generation, reclaiming ground so gradually that those living beside it often adapt without recognizing the scale of what is being lost. Yet when archaeologists compare the coastlines of today with those that existed several thousand years ago, the difference is astonishing. Entire landscapes that once echoed with human voices now lie beneath cold, silent water. At the height of the last ice age, enormous quantities of Earth's water remain locked inside continental ice sheets. Sea levels stand more than 100 meters lower than they do today. Vast coastal plains extend far beyond modern shorelines. Rivers carve channels across land that has since disappeared beneath oceans. People hunt fish, gather plants, and eventually establish settlements on ground now completely submerged. As the great glaciers melt over thousands of years, the oceans steadily expand. This is not a smooth or perfectly constant process. There are periods of relatively rapid rise and periods when the pace slows. Meltwater pulses release tremendous volumes of fresh water into the world's oceans. Although the most dramatic increases occur before the rise of large civilizations, sea levels continue climbing well into the Middle and later Holocene. Even a seemingly modest increase becomes transformative when measured across centuries. A coastline shifting only a few meters each generation may appear insignificant. Across 500 years, however, entire estuaries change shape. Marshes replace dry meadows. Barrier islands migrate. Saltwater creeps into freshwater wetlands. Harbours once naturally protected become exposed while others vanish beneath rising tides. To the people living through these centuries, the changes are practical rather than theoretical. A family moves its fishing hut slightly farther inland after repeated storm surges. Farmers abandon low fields that become increasingly salty. A burial ground near the shore slowly erodes until ancient graves collapse into the sea. Children grow up believing the coastline has always existed where they know it, unaware that their grandparents played hundreds of meters farther toward what is now open water. One of the most remarkable examples of this vanished world lies beneath the North Sea. Today, ferries, cargo ships, offshore wind farms, and fishing vessels cross these waters every day. Looking across the waves, it is difficult to imagine that a vast landscape once connected what are now Britain, the Netherlands, Germany, and Denmark. Yet for thousands of years this region forms a rich plain of rivers, forests, marshes, and lakes. Modern researchers call this lost landscape Doggerland. Far from being a barren land bridge, Doggerland appears to have been one of the most productive environments in prehistoric Europe. Rivers winding through fertile valleys support abundant wildlife. Red deer, wild horses, aurochs, elk, and wild boar roam extensive woodlands and grasslands. Fish fill rivers and estuaries. Birds gather in wetlands during seasonal migrations. Human communities exploit these rich resources with remarkable skill. For generations, fishermen working the North Sea unknowingly recover pieces of this forgotten world. Their nets occasionally bring up prehistoric antlers, mammoth bones, stone tools, fragments of worked wood, and even human remains. At first, these discoveries seem isolated curiosities. Over time, however, they begin forming a coherent picture. Advances in underwater surveying, seismic mapping, and marine archaeology reveal ancient river channels, lake basins, hills, and valleys preserved beneath layers of sediment. The evidence suggests that thousands of square kilometers of habitable land gradually disappear beneath rising seas. Scholars continue debating exactly how many people inhabit Doggerland at different times because no written records survive, and much of the archaeological evidence remains inaccessible beneath the seabed. Nevertheless, what survives strongly indicates that this is not an empty wilderness, but a lived-in landscape supporting generations of hunter-gatherers adapting to remarkable environmental change. Some communities likely retreat gradually as coastlines shift. Others may experience sudden local disasters. Around 8,200 years ago, a massive underwater landslide off the coast of present-day Norway triggers what scientists call the Storegga tsunami. This enormous wave system spreads across parts of the North Atlantic, striking coastlines already transformed by rising seas. Geological evidence indicates that certain coastal regions experience catastrophic flooding. Researchers continue investigating precisely how severely Doggerland is affected. The evidence remains incomplete, but many believe the tsunami compounds an already difficult situation. Communities that have spent centuries adapting to slowly advancing seas suddenly face an event far beyond ordinary experience. Even if survivors rebuild the remaining land, continue shrinking during subsequent generations. Doggerland is not unique. Across Southeast Asia, lower sea levels during the Ice Age exposed the vast continental shelf known today as Sunderland. Modern Indonesia consists of thousands of islands, but during earlier periods many are connected by extensive plains crossed by rivers larger than some existing waterways. As sea levels rise, these landscapes fragment into islands, fundamentally altering migration routes for both animals and humans. In the Persian Gulf, another remarkable transformation unfolds. Some researchers propose that before the Gulf fills with seawater, it contains an extensive river valley, where human populations may have lived during particularly favorable climatic periods. While many details remain uncertain, geological evidence clearly demonstrates that the shoreline occupies dramatically different positions over thousands of years. The Black Sea has also inspired intense debate. One hypothesis suggests that Mediterranean waters pour catastrophically into a lower freshwater basin thousands of years ago, rapidly expanding the sea. Other researchers argue for a slower, more complex process. No single explanation fully accounts for all available evidence, and the question remains actively discussed. Regardless of which interpretation proves most accurate, the region undoubtedly experiences profound environmental change affecting the people who inhabit its shores. These drowned landscapes possess a unique emotional power. Unlike ruined temples standing above ground or abandoned cities preserved within desert-submerged worlds, remain almost completely hidden. Waves conceal roads that no longer lead anywhere. Ancient campsites lie beneath layers of mud. Forests once alive with bird song rest upright beneath cold water, their roots still anchored in soils untouched by sunlight for thousands of years. Divers occasionally encounter tree stumps preserved beneath coastal waters. Offshore construction projects uncover peat deposits formed when those same areas exist as dry land. Sonar images reveal forgotten river channels winding across the seafloor exactly as they once wound across living landscapes. These discoveries remind us that maps are temporary. The coastlines printed in modern atlases represent only one moment within Earth's long history. Earlier generations inherit different worlds, walk across lands that have vanished, and build memories in places impossible to revisit. The disappearance of these coastal worlds also carries another consequence. As populations retreat inland, they enter territories already occupied by others. Resources become more contested. New relationships emerge between neighboring communities. Trade routes shift. Migration accelerates. The rising sea does not simply erase land. It quietly redraws the human geography of entire regions, setting in motion changes whose consequences will unfold for thousands of years. As coastlines retreat and familiar landscapes slowly vanish beneath advancing seas, the people forced inland do not arrive in empty territory. Every valley already supports farmers, herders, hunters, or growing towns with their own traditions, boundaries, and fragile balances. The disappearance of one world quietly increases the pressure on another. It is here, long before the famous collapses recorded in history, that environmental change begins reshaping politics, economies, and the daily calculations of survival. The earliest civilizations are often imagined as isolated achievements rising independently from fertile soil beside great rivers. In reality, they exist within vast networks of movement. Grain travels from one region to another. Stone unsuitable for local construction is carried across mountains. Copper ores move hundreds of kilometers before being smelted. Obsidian, prized for its razor-sharp edges, passes through countless hands before reaching distant settlements. Even before written records become common, ideas spread almost as effectively as goods. These connections create prosperity. They also create dependence. A village that once survives entirely from nearby resources gradually begins relying upon materials imported from distant regions. A growing city demands timber from forests many days away. Metalworkers require copper mined beyond the horizon, and tin obtained through remarkably long trade routes. Farmers exchange surplus grain for tools crafted elsewhere. Every successful connection strengthens civilization, while simultaneously making it more vulnerable to disruption. For generations, however, the system appears remarkably resilient. Along the Nile, annual floods continue nourishing one of the world's most productive agricultural landscapes. Egyptian communities learn not only to anticipate these seasonal waters, but to organize much of their society around them. The river becomes both highway and lifeline, connecting settlements separated by hundreds of kilometers. Predictable flooding allows increasingly sophisticated administration, surplus food production, and monumental construction that still inspires wonder today. Farther east, between the Tigris and Euphrates, another remarkable experiment unfolds. The plains of Mesopotamia receive far less dependable rainfall than Egypt, yet ingenious irrigation transforms broad stretches of otherwise difficult land into productive farmland. Networks of canals redirect river water toward fields of barley and wheat. Cities expand into centers of administration, religion, and commerce. Writing emerges partly from the practical demands of managing increasingly complex economies. Clay tablets preserve records of harvests, taxes livestock, and trade with astonishing precision. To the northeast, communities occupying the highlands supply valuable raw materials unavailable in the river valleys below. Timber, metal, stone, and livestock move through exchange networks linking dramatically different environments. Mountains, plains, deserts, and coastlines become economically intertwined. Across the Indus Valley, cities rise according to principles that still impress modern archaeologists. Settlements such as Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa display carefully planned streets, sophisticated drainage systems, standardized brick sizes, and remarkable urban organization. Unlike many later civilizations, these cities reveal surprisingly little evidence of extravagant royal monuments dominating the landscape. Instead, their greatest achievements often lie hidden beneath the surface in sanitation engineering and thoughtful planning. To the west, Mediterranean coastlines host growing maritime communities. Small harbors become gateways between islands, peninsulas, and distant shores. Sailors learn seasonal winds and currents with extraordinary skill. Trade spreads not only objects but technologies, agricultural practices, artistic styles, and religious ideas. A pot fashioned in one culture may influence craftsmen hundreds of kilometers away. Seeds carried aboard merchant vessels introduce unfamiliar crops into entirely new environments. Civilization, even in its earliest forms, is already becoming global on its own scale. Yet beneath this impressive expansion, subtle warning signs continue accumulating. In some regions, forests begin shrinking under the demands of growing populations. Timber is needed for houses, temples, ships, charcoal production, irrigation works, and defensive walls. Clearing land for agriculture removes trees that once stabilized soils and influenced local water cycles. Most communities cannot observe these cumulative effects across centuries. Each generation simply clears a little more land than the last. Soils themselves gradually change. Repeated cultivation without sufficient recovery can reduce fertility in vulnerable areas. Irrigation, although enormously productive, sometimes brings dissolved salts to the surface, particularly in hot, dry climates, where evaporation exceeds rainfall. Over many generations, these salts accumulate within fields, reducing crop yields. Ancient Mesopotamian records suggest that farmers increasingly shift from wheat toward more salt-tolerant barley in certain regions, a subtle clue that environmental pressures are already influencing agricultural choices. Scholars still debate how significant salinization becomes compared with political instability, warfare, or other economic factors. The evidence varies considerably between locations, and no single explanation fully accounts for the fortunes of every city. Nevertheless, the archaeological record demonstrates that environmental management becomes an increasingly important challenge for complex societies. Water itself begins behaving differently in some regions. A river changing course by only a few kilometers can transform fortunes almost overnight. Ports lose direct access to navigable channels. Irrigation canals require expensive reconstruction. Productive farmland becomes isolated from reliable water supplies. Communities built around one landscape suddenly find themselves living within another. The Indus civilization offers a striking example of this complexity. For many years, scholars proposed that a single catastrophic invasion explained its decline. Modern evidence paints a far more intricate picture. Geological studies indicate that changing river systems, shifting monsoon patterns, and gradual environmental transformation likely play substantial roles alongside social and economic factors. Rather than disappearing suddenly, many settlements evolve, relocate, or diminish over extended periods. This pattern appears repeatedly throughout ancient history. Civilizations rarely vanish in one dramatic moment. Instead, they experience decades or centuries of adaptation before reaching points where accumulated pressures become increasingly difficult to overcome. Population growth introduces another layer of vulnerability. A small farming village can often relocate if local conditions deteriorate. A great city supporting tens of thousands of inhabitants cannot move so easily. Urban populations require enormous quantities of grain, fuel, water, livestock, building materials, and imported goods every single year. Any disruption affecting multiple harvests or major trade routes reverberates through the entire society. Success itself becomes a source of risk. The larger and more interconnected a civilization grows, the more dependent it becomes upon systems functioning reliably across great distances. When everything works, prosperity expands rapidly. When several components begin failing simultaneously, recovery becomes much more difficult. Meanwhile, ordinary people continue living lives that rarely appear in surviving inscriptions. Farmers rise before dawn to inspect irrigation channels damaged by seasonal floods. Shepherds guide flocks toward increasingly distant grazing lands. Potters search for suitable clay as riverbanks shift. Fishermen notice familiar spawning grounds becoming less productive. Traders adjust routes around newly emerging marshes or abandoned settlements. Each decision is practical, local, and immediate. Taken together, however, these countless adjustments reveal something profound. The old environmental stability that quietly supports civilization for millennia is beginning to loosen. No kingdom has collapsed yet. No famous empire has disappeared. Monumental cities still dominate their horizons. Temples continue receiving offerings. Kings continue commissioning inscriptions celebrating victories and prosperity. Yet beneath these confident displays, the foundations are changing. The landscapes upon which the first civilizations build their greatness are no longer behaving exactly as they once did. Rivers wander, rains fluctuate, forests retreat. Fields demand more careful management. Populations become increasingly interconnected and increasingly exposed to distant events beyond their control. The old world has not yet fallen, but it has begun asking difficult questions that even its greatest kingdoms will soon struggle to answer. The roads still carry merchants. Harbours remain crowded with ships. Bronze tools continue changing hands in busy marketplaces, and royal palaces still record tribute arriving from distant provinces. At first glance, the great trading networks of the ancient world appear stronger than ever. Wealth flows across mountains, deserts, and seas with a confidence built over centuries. Yet beneath this appearance of stability, tiny fractures are beginning to spread through one of humanity's earliest interconnected economies. Long before modern globalization, the civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean and Western Asia are already linked by astonishingly complex systems of exchange. Copper mined on the island of Cyprus travels to workshops hundreds of kilometers away. Tin far rarer than copper arrives from distant regions that remain only partially understood even today. Together, these two metals produce bronze, the defining material of an age. Without bronze, armies lose weapons, farmers lose durable tools, craftsmen lose essential equipment, and builders lose many of the instruments needed for large-scale construction. Bronze is not simply another commodity. It is the technological foundation upon which entire civilizations depend. The difficulty lies in geography. Copper exists in several accessible regions, but tin is remarkably scarce. Ancient merchants must transport it across extraordinary distances, passing through multiple kingdoms, languages, and political systems before it finally reaches bronze workshops. Every stage of that journey depends upon trust, diplomacy, infrastructure, and relative security. For generations, this intricate system functioned surprisingly well. Merchant caravans cross Anatolian plateaus loaded with textiles, precious stones, timber, ivory, oils, and metal ingots. Ships sail from Levantine ports carrying glass, wine, pottery, cedar wood, and luxury goods destined for royal courts. Egyptian grain supports neighbouring regions during difficult harvests. Mycenaean craftsmen produce finely decorated ceramics that appear across the Mediterranean. The Hittite Empire oversees strategic routes linking Asia and Europe, while powerful city-states along the Syrian coast serve as commercial crossroads between continents. Each civilization specializes in different strengths. None is entirely self-sufficient. This growing interdependence encourages prosperity unlike anything earlier generations experience. Royal families exchange diplomatic gifts that include exotic animals, gold vessels, carved ivory, and carefully crafted weapons. Marriage alliances unite distant kingdoms. Scribes write letters across hundreds of kilometers using international diplomatic conventions. Even political rivals often recognize that stable trade benefits everyone. The remarkable archive discovered at Amarna in Egypt provides a rare glimpse into this interconnected world. Hundreds of clay tablets preserve correspondence between rulers who discuss marriages, diplomacy, military concerns, and requests for valuable materials. Kings address one another as equals, negotiating relationships that stretch across much of the known world. These letters reveal something striking. The rulers of great kingdoms rely upon one another far more than earlier historians once imagined. A shortage of metal in one region becomes another ruler's concern. Delayed shipments provoke diplomatic complaints. Gifts serve political purposes beyond simple generosity. Prestige itself depends upon maintaining reliable exchange. The world is becoming increasingly connected and increasingly fragile. A single failed harvest no longer affects only one valley. Poor agricultural conditions reduce surplus grain available for trade. Merchants carrying less food have less capacity to purchase foreign goods. Craftsmen receive fewer raw materials. Tax revenues decline. Armies become more expensive to maintain. Local shortages ripple outward through networks extending hundreds of kilometers. Climate appears to contribute quietly to these growing pressures. Tree ring evidence from several regions suggests episodes of prolonged drought during the centuries approaching the end of the Bronze Age. Lake sediments, cave formations, and pollen records also indicate significant environmental variability, affecting parts of the eastern Mediterranean and Near East. Scholars continue debating the precise timing and severity of these droughts, because local conditions differ considerably from one region to another. Nevertheless, multiple independent lines of evidence suggest that several societies experience increasingly difficult environmental conditions during roughly the same broad period. Imagine the practical consequences. Fields yield slightly smaller harvests year after year. Reservoirs refill less completely. Pastures support fewer animals. Villages once capable of exporting grain begin consuming everything they produce simply to survive. The effects spread slowly at first. Merchants alter established routes to avoid areas suffering repeated shortages. Caravans require stronger military escorts as competition for resources increases. Pirates attracted by valuable cargoes and weakened coastal defences become increasingly active in some maritime regions. Insurance does not exist in the modern sense, but the risks of commerce rise dramatically. The archaeological record preserves remarkable evidence of this flourishing trade just before many of these systems begin unravelling. One of the most extraordinary discoveries comes from the Uluburun shipwreck off the southern coast of present-day Turkey. Dating to the late Bronze Age, the vessel carries an astonishing cargo: copper ingots, tin ingots, glass, ivory, ebony jewellery, resins, pottery, precious metals and luxury objects originating from numerous different regions. This single ship represents an entire world connected by commerce. Its cargo demonstrates that materials, technologies, artistic styles and ideas travel enormous distances with impressive regularity. Yet the wreck also serves as a reminder of vulnerability. Every shipment crossing the sea depends upon favourable weather, secure ports, skilled crews, political stability and profitable markets waiting at its destination. Remove several of those conditions simultaneously and the entire system begins struggling. The first signs rarely appear spectacular. A delayed convoy, an abandoned warehouse, a harbour receiving fewer foreign vessels than usual, a caravan arriving months behind schedule. Royal administrators notice declining tax receipts. Craftsmen complain about shortages of imported metals. Palaces postpone ambitious construction projects. None of these developments alone signals impending collapse. Together, however, they reveal growing strain. Ordinary people likely experience these disruptions differently than kings. A blacksmith may spend weeks waiting for metal deliveries that once arrived routinely. Farmers travelling to market discover prices fluctuating unpredictably. Sailors hear rumours that familiar ports are no longer considered safe. Families begin storing more food whenever harvests allow uncertain whether next year will prove as generous. What survives in the archaeological record suggests that many communities attempt adaptation rather than surrender. Alternative trade routes emerge. Local substitutes replace scarce imported materials whenever possible. Political alliances shift. New technologies begin appearing alongside older ones. Human societies display remarkable resilience even under mounting pressure. But resilience has limits. The interconnected world that generations carefully construct now depends upon countless moving parts functioning together. Environmental instability, economic disruption, political rivalry, migration, and regional conflict begin reinforcing one another in ways no individual kingdom fully understands. The old commercial highways remain open, ships still sail, markets still operate, kings continue exchanging gifts and messages. Yet beneath this appearance of continuity, confidence is quietly evaporating. The invisible threads binding the great civilizations together are beginning to fray one connection at a time. Within only a few generations, those fraying threads will snap across much of the Eastern Mediterranean, ushering in one of the most remarkable periods of transformation the ancient world has ever known. For centuries, the Bronze Age appears almost indestructible. Across the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East, powerful kingdoms dominate landscapes connected by diplomacy, commerce, and military strength. Massive stone walls surround prosperous cities. Palaces oversee sophisticated bureaucracies. Scribes fill archives with clay tablets, recording taxes, treaties, harvests, and royal decrees. Merchant ships cross familiar sea lanes, carrying copper, tin, timber wine, olive oil, glass, ivory, and precious textiles. To those living within these kingdoms, the political order seems as permanent as the mountains themselves. Then within little more than a lifetime, much of that familiar world begins to unravel. Between roughly 1200 and 1100 before the Common Era, an extraordinary sequence of upheavals spreads across the Eastern Mediterranean. Some cities burn and are never rebuilt. Others shrink dramatically. Long-established trade routes collapse. Royal dynasties disappear from the historical record. Entire writing systems fall out of use. Regions that once exchanged luxury goods across thousands of kilometers become fragmented into smaller, more isolated societies. Historians refer to this transformation as the Late Bronze Age collapse. The name sounds straightforward. The reality is anything but. Unlike the sudden destruction of a city buried beneath volcanic ash, the collapse is not a single event with one clear cause. It unfolds differently from one region to another. Some kingdoms fall rapidly, others endure for decades before weakening. Certain communities adapt successfully and survive while neighbouring settlements vanish almost completely. This uneven pattern has fascinated scholars for generations because no single explanation fully accounts for what happens. At the height of its power, Egypt remains one of the greatest civilizations on Earth. Its temples command enormous resources. Monumental statues celebrate royal authority. Agricultural wealth flowing from the Nile supports a sophisticated administration extending across vast territories. Even as neighbouring kingdoms experience increasing instability, Egyptian inscriptions continue projecting confidence and strength. Yet beneath these grand monuments, warning signs begin appearing. Military campaigns become more frequent. Frontier defences demand greater attention. Diplomatic correspondence reflects growing anxiety about conditions beyond Egypt's borders. Grain shipments become increasingly important. Foreign allies request assistance with mounting desperation. Farther north, the Hittite Empire controls much of Anatolia and serves as one of the dominant powers of the age. Its capital Hattusa contains imposing walls, monumental gates, temples, archives, and administrative buildings reflecting centuries of political success. Then something remarkable happens. The empire disappears. Hattusa is abandoned. Royal authority collapses. The once powerful state fragments into smaller successor kingdoms that never recover their previous influence. The archaeological remains are striking. Buildings fall into ruin. Administrative records cease. Trade connections weaken dramatically. The silence left behind speaks almost as loudly as the inscriptions produced during centuries of prosperity. Across mainland Greece, the Mycenaean world experiences similar turmoil. Magnificent palace centres such as Mycenae, Pylos, Tiryns and Thebes dominate regional politics during the Late Bronze Age. Their rulers oversee redistributive economies in which agricultural products, manufactured goods, and imported materials pass through centralized administrative systems recorded in the Linear B writing script. Then many of these palace complexes burn. Archives are destroyed. Administrative writing largely disappears. Population declines in numerous regions. Some settlements survive, but the political landscape changes fundamentally. For several centuries afterward, Greece enters a period traditionally described as the Greek Dark Age, although modern scholarship increasingly recognizes that this era involves transformation rather than complete cultural disappearance. The Levant tells another complex story. Important coastal cities continue operating in some areas, while others suffer severe destruction. Ugarit, one of the great commercial centres linking multiple civilizations, leaves behind particularly haunting evidence. Clay tablets discovered within its ruins preserve correspondence written during the city's final days. Some letters mention enemy fleets approaching. Others request urgent military assistance. One message indicates that the kingdom's own forces are deployed elsewhere, leaving the city dangerously exposed. The archives end abruptly. The city burns. Life continues elsewhere, but Ugarit itself never regains its former importance. Few archaeological discoveries capture the human experience of collapse more vividly than these unfinished conversations frozen in fired clay. The people writing those tablets do not know historians will read their words more than 3,000 years later. They simply hope help will arrive in time. It never does. Perhaps the most famous mystery associated with this period involves the so-called Sea Peoples. Egyptian inscriptions describe groups arriving by both land and sea, engaging in battles against Egyptian forces during the reigns of Meneptah and Rameses III. For many years, historians imagined the Sea Peoples as a single invading nation sweeping across the Mediterranean and destroying civilizations wherever they travelled. Modern research paints a more complicated picture. The term likely encompasses multiple different groups rather than one unified people. Some may have been migrants fleeing environmental pressures or political instability elsewhere. Others could have been mercenaries, displaced communities, opportunistic raiders, or shifting coalitions formed during a period of widespread disruption. Scholars still debate their precise origins because the surviving evidence remains incomplete. Importantly, most researchers no longer view the Sea Peoples as the sole cause of the Bronze Age collapse. Instead, they appear to be one component within a much broader crisis already affecting many interconnected societies. This broader perspective has become increasingly influential over recent decades. Rather than searching for one catastrophic trigger, archaeologists now examine how multiple pressures reinforce one another. Climate variability reduces agricultural reliability. Food shortages increase political tension. Trade disruptions limit access to essential raw materials. Economic stress weakens governments. Migration intensifies competition over resources. Military conflicts become more frequent. Once central administrations begin failing, they lose the ability to coordinate responses to further crises. The result resembles a chain reaction. One problem magnifies another. Every weakened institution makes the next challenge more difficult to overcome. This concept, sometimes described as systems collapse, helps explain why so many different kingdoms experience instability within a relatively short historical period, despite possessing unique cultures, governments, and environments. The interconnected world that once generates extraordinary prosperity now spreads disruption just as effectively. A shortage of tin affects bronze production across multiple kingdoms. Reduced trade limits diplomatic exchanges. Political instability discourages merchants from traveling dangerous routes. Food shortages encourage migration. Migration increases regional conflict. Conflict further disrupts agriculture and commerce. The cycle feeds upon itself. Yet even during this remarkable transformation, humanity does not disappear. Villages continue farming, families continue raising children, craftsmen continue adapting with whatever materials remain available. Many communities survive precisely because they are smaller, more flexible and less dependent upon the vast bureaucratic systems now beginning to fail. The collapse is therefore both devastating and creative. It marks the end of one interconnected Bronze Age order while quietly preparing the foundations for entirely new civilizations. But for those watching palace roofs burn, ports fall silent and royal dynasties vanish. Within a single lifetime, it must have seemed as though the old world itself was slipping beyond recovery. The disappearance that began with subtle environmental shifts has now reached the heart of civilization. When a city dies, it rarely disappears all at once. The final day preserved in archaeology is almost never the final day experienced by its inhabitants. There are weeks of uncertainty before the flames. There are months of declining trade before the abandoned warehouses. There are years of difficult harvest before the empty granaries. By the time a great capital falls silent, its people have often been adapting to change for an entire generation. The ruins that survive today capture only the last visible moment of a much longer story. Walk through the remains of an ancient city in the eastern Mediterranean, and it is easy to imagine catastrophe arriving in a single violent afternoon. Charred beams lie where roofs collapsed. Broken pottery remains scattered across floors. Arrowheads appear near gateways. Walls lean outward after centuries of neglect. Everything seems frozen in the instant of destruction. Yet archaeology reveals something more complicated. Many cities experience repeated cycles of rebuilding before they are finally abandoned. Fire destroys one neighborhood while another continues functioning. Earthquakes damage monumental buildings that are only partially repaired. Population gradually concentrates inside smaller defended districts as outer suburbs empty. What appears today as one ruined city often represents centuries of adaptation compressed into a single archaeological layer. One of the clearest examples comes from the Great Palace at Pylos in southwestern Greece. Before its destruction, the palace serves as the administrative heart of a prosperous Mycenaean kingdom. Hundreds of clay tablets written in the Linear B script record extraordinary details of everyday governance. They list livestock grain supplies, bronze allocations, chariot components, religious offerings, military personnel and skilled workers. Rather than celebrating kings or battles, these records reveal the machinery of an organized society, functioning with remarkable efficiency. Then the palace burns. Ironically, the fire that destroys the building also preserves its archives. The clay tablets are never intended to last for thousands of years. They are simply dried for temporary administrative use. Under ordinary circumstances, they would eventually be recycled or discarded. But intense heat accidentally bakes the clay into permanent ceramic, allowing modern archaeologists to recover thousands of records that would otherwise have vanished forever. The final entries suggest officials are taking unusual precautions. Some tablets appear to document emergency military preparations, including the deployment of coastal watchers and the organization of defensive forces. Scholars continue debating exactly what threat these preparations address. Was an invasion expected? Were pirate raids increasing? Were internal conflicts erupting? The evidence remains incomplete. What survives suggests only that the administrators recognize growing danger. Soon afterward, the palace is destroyed. Its bureaucracy disappears. The writing system that serves Mycenaean administration largely falls out of use across Greece for centuries. The silence that follows is profound. Elsewhere, similar stories unfold with different details. At Hattusa, once the magnificent capital of the Hittite Empire, massive fortification walls still trace the outlines of a city that commands enormous authority. Temples, storage facilities, official residences and archives demonstrate a level of political organization rivaling any kingdom of the ancient world. Today, visitors walk among impressive stone foundations surrounded by quiet hills. Birdsong replaces royal processions. Grass grows where diplomats once negotiate international treaties. The city is eventually abandoned rather than continuously occupied, leaving behind one of the ancient world's most striking examples of imperial disappearance. Scholars continue discussing the precise sequence of events leading to Hattus's decline. Food shortages, political fragmentation, military conflict, environmental pressures, and shifting trade networks all appear to contribute. No single explanation fully accounts for the empire's collapse. The archaeological evidence instead points toward accumulated instability. Farther south, Ugarit presents an especially moving case because its destruction preserves the final correspondence of people confronting a rapidly changing world. Letters recovered from the city's archives describe enemy movements, delayed military support, and growing uncertainty. Ships expected to provide assistance fail to arrive in time. Neighboring kingdoms face crises of their own and cannot offer meaningful help. The city stands within one of the most interconnected commercial systems ever created. Yet when that system begins failing, its greatest strength becomes one of its greatest weaknesses. Help depends upon functioning allies. When everyone is struggling simultaneously, rescue becomes increasingly unlikely. The destruction layers uncovered at Ugarit contain burned buildings, collapsed structures, and abandoned possessions that speak less of orderly relocation than of sudden disruption. Even so, archaeologists remain cautious. Not every burned city represents foreign invasion. Fire companies, accidents, earthquakes, civil conflict, ritual activity, and deliberate abandonment, as well as warfare. Careful excavation examines countless details before drawing conclusions. Burn patterns, weapon concentrations collapsed, architecture, human remains, botanical evidence, and radiocarbon dating all contribute pieces to the larger puzzle. This careful approach has transformed the study of ancient collapse. Earlier generations of historians sometimes favored simple explanations built around dramatic invasions or heroic conquests. Modern archaeology generally reveals more nuanced realities. One city falls after prolonged drought weakens its economy. Another suffers repeated earthquakes. A third loses access to vital trade routes. A fourth becomes politically isolated after the collapse of neighboring allies. Each story is unique, even while participating in broader regional transformations. Some of the most haunting discoveries come not from palaces but from ordinary neighborhoods. Homes abandoned in haste sometimes preserve cooking vessels still resting beside hearths. Storage jars remain partly filled with grain. Loom weights lie where weaving suddenly stops. Children's toys occasionally emerge from collapsed rooms, silent reminders that great historical events are experienced by families rather than abstract civilizations. These quiet objects humanize collapse. History often remembers kings. Archaeology remembers everyone else. It remembers the baker whose oven is never used again, the metalworker whose unfinished tools remain scattered across the workshop floor, the elderly resident unable to flee as quickly as younger neighbors, the child who leaves behind a carved animal figurine now buried beneath centuries of debris. Across the eastern Mediterranean, layers of destruction become separated by surprisingly short spans of time. Excavations reveal burned settlements in Cyprus, coastal Anatolia, the Levant, mainland Greece, and other regions. Not every site is destroyed. Not every kingdom disappears. But enough experience severe disruption to demonstrate that something extraordinary is affecting the wider system. Equally important are the places that survive. Certain Phoenician cities continue adapting despite regional instability. Some inland settlements actually expand as populations relocate away from vulnerable coastlines. Communities less dependent upon palace bureaucracies often prove unexpectedly resilient. Collapse, therefore, does not affect everyone equally. It redistributes opportunity even as it destroys established centers of power. The world emerging from these centuries is different rather than empty. Still, for those standing among the smoking ruins of once great capitals, such long-term transformations would offer little comfort. Their libraries have burned. Their rulers have vanished. Their trade partners no longer answer. The monuments built to proclaim eternal stability now overlook abandoned streets where weeds push through cracked stone. The old world is not erased in one terrible day. It fades city by city, archive by archive, generation by generation, until silence settles over places that once believed themselves immortal. As the palaces fall quiet and the great capitals lose their authority, history itself begins to narrow. Royal inscriptions become rarer. Administrative archives disappear. Monumental construction slows or ceases altogether. For later generations, it almost seems as though civilization itself has withdrawn. Yet this impression is partly an illusion created by the kinds of evidence that survive. Kings leave records because they possess scribes. Ordinary families leave behind broken pottery, worn tools, abandoned hearths, and footprints across forgotten landscapes. When written history grows silent, archaeology begins to speak more clearly. For every famous city that collapses, thousands of smaller communities continue living beyond the attention of royal chroniclers. Farmers still rise before sunrise. Shepherds continue leading flocks through changing pastures. Fishermen repair nets beside rivers whose courses have slowly shifted. Mothers teach children how to grind grain-shaped clay vessels, weave textiles, and recognize the changing seasons. These lives rarely appear in surviving inscriptions. They nevertheless become the foundation upon which the next age is built. One of the most remarkable discoveries of modern archaeology is that collapse often looks very different from the perspective of ordinary people than it does from the perspective of kings. A palace economy may fail completely while nearby villages continue functioning with surprising resilience. A royal dynasty may disappear, yet local traditions survive almost unchanged. Trade in luxury goods may collapse while everyday exchange between neighbouring settlements continues. This difference forces historians to reconsider what the word collapse actually means. For rulers, it often means the loss of centralized authority, taxation, military organization, and international diplomacy. For ordinary families, it may simply mean adapting to a more local way of life. Many communities become smaller. Large urban centers that once depend upon complex administrative systems gradually give way to villages where households produce a greater share of their own food, clothing, and tools. Specialization decreases in some regions. Instead of relying upon distant merchants for essential goods, communities increasingly depend upon local resources and familiar skills. At first glance, this appears to represent decline. In some respects, it certainly does. Sophisticated writing systems disappear from daily administration in parts of the Eastern Mediterranean. Long-distance trade contracts, large public construction projects become uncommon. Certain artistic traditions vanish entirely. Yet another perspective reveals remarkable resilience. Smaller communities often prove more adaptable because they require fewer resources and less centralized coordination. Without enormous palaces demanding tribute, local populations retain greater control over agricultural production. Without complex bureaucracies, decisions can sometimes be made more quickly. Life may become materially simpler, but simplicity is not always synonymous with failure. Across the Greek world, after the collapse of the Mycenaean palace system, settlements shift toward hilltops offering greater defensive advantages. Archaeologists find evidence that populations relocate rather than disappear. People build new homes using materials readily available nearby. Pottery styles evolve. Burial customs gradually change. The society emerging from these centuries is unmistakably different from the one preceding it. Yet it remains connected through countless threads of cultural memory. Knowledge also survives in unexpected ways. Writing may vanish from official administration, but practical knowledge continues passing directly from one generation to the next. Farmers do not need written manuals to recognize fertile soil. Boat builders still understand how timber behaves when shaped into hulls. Metalworkers experiment with new techniques even as bronze becomes harder to obtain. Oral traditions preserve genealogies, seasonal rhythms, navigation routes, and local histories long after palace archives have burned. This transfer of knowledge becomes one of humanity's greatest strengths. Civilization is never stored only in libraries. It also exists in hands. Hands remember. A potter's fingers know precisely how damp clay should feel before shaping begins. A shepherd recognizes subtle changes in animal behavior that signal approaching weather. A carpenter understands which trees resist decay better than others. A midwife carries generations of accumulated medical experience even if no written text records her methods. These forms of knowledge are extraordinarily durable because they live within daily practice rather than official institutions. Migration becomes another defining feature of this changing world. As environmental conditions shift and political systems fragment, families and entire communities search for new opportunities. Some move only short distances to more reliable water sources. Others travel hundreds of kilometers, joining populations with different languages and traditions. The archaeological record preserves these movements through changing pottery styles, burial customs, settlement patterns, isotopic analysis of human remains, and increasingly through ancient DNA research. Modern genetics has transformed the study of these migrations. Tiny fragments of preserved DNA recovered from ancient skeletons reveal relationships impossible to detect only a few decades ago. Researchers can now trace broad patterns of population movement across Europe, Western Asia, and parts of Africa with growing precision. The results consistently show that ancient societies are rarely isolated. Instead, they are continually shaped by waves of migration, intermarriage, cultural exchange, and adaptation. Importantly, these discoveries challenge older narratives that portray collapse as complete replacement. In many regions, newcomers and existing populations blend rather than one simply eliminating the other. Languages influence one another. Technologies spread across cultural boundaries. Religious practices merge. The evidence suggests continuity alongside transformation. Scholars still debate the relative importance of migration in different regions because genetic, archaeological, and linguistic evidence does not always align perfectly. The picture remains incomplete. What becomes increasingly clear, however, is that the end of one political order rarely means the disappearance of the people themselves. Instead, identities evolve. A community that once considered itself part of a great kingdom gradually develops new traditions suited to changing realities. Children born after the collapse know little of palace bureaucracy. Their world revolves around family village, neighbouring valleys, and seasonal cycles rather than distant royal courts. This transition also alters warfare. Large professional armies supported by centralized governments become less common in some regions. Smaller local conflicts replace imperial campaigns. Fortified hilltop settlements reflect a world in which security depends more upon community cooperation than distant rulers. The rhythms of daily life slow. Luxury imports become rare. Locally crafted pottery replaces finely decorated foreign wares. Simple iron tools begin appearing with increasing frequency, quietly marking another technological transformation that will eventually define an entirely new age. To later historians, these centuries sometimes seem obscure because written sources become scarce. Yet obscurity should never be mistaken for emptiness. People continue loving grieving, celebrating harvests, burying their dead, teaching children, repairing homes, tending animals, and adapting to landscapes still changing around them. History does not pause simply because fewer records survive. In many ways, it becomes more human. The old world, built upon palaces and international diplomacy, has begun fading into memory. What remains are ordinary people carrying fragments of that vanished age into a future they cannot yet imagine, preserving enough of the past to ensure that civilization, although transformed, never truly disappears. Even as kingdoms fracture and great cities fall silent, the natural world continues following rhythms far older than any civilization. Winds cross deserts without regard for royal borders. Rivers swell or shrink according to mountain snows and seasonal rains rather than human ambition. Volcanoes accumulate pressure beneath the Earth's crust for centuries before releasing it in moments. Earthquakes strike without warning. Drought creeps forward almost invisibly until entire regions discover that familiar harvests no longer arrive. Nature does not intend to reshape history, yet history is continually reshaped by nature. For much of human existence, environmental stability has been the unseen partner of civilization. Stable rainfall allows agriculture to flourish. Predictable rivers support irrigation. Reliable seasons encourage long-term planning. When those patterns begin shifting, societies must respond whether they fully understand the causes or not. One of the greatest challenges facing modern researchers is separating coincidence from causation. If a kingdom declines during a prolonged drought, does the climate deserve primary responsibility? Or does political instability simply become more visible because environmental pressures expose existing weaknesses? Most scholars now favor a more balanced interpretation. Climate rarely acts alone. Instead, it multiplies the consequences of problems already present. Imagine a prosperous kingdom enjoying abundant harvests. Political disagreements certainly exist. Taxes provoke complaints. Border conflicts occasionally erupt. Trade experiences temporary interruptions. Yet plentiful food and strong economic reserves allow most crises to remain manageable. Now imagine that same kingdom experiencing several decades of increasingly unreliable rainfall. Harvests decline. Food prices rise. Governments collect less tax because farmers produce less grain. Military campaigns become harder to finance. Trade partners facing similar shortages reduce exports. Migration increases as rural populations search for more dependable land. The political system now faces every previous challenge while possessing fewer resources to address them. Environmental stress does not invent instability. It amplifies it. Tree ring studies provide some of the clearest evidence for these ancient climate fluctuations. Every year a tree adds another ring of growth. Wet years generally produce broader rings. Dry years often leave narrower ones. Across thousands of preserved trees, researchers reconstruct rainfall patterns, extending back centuries or even millennia. These records reveal episodes of prolonged drought affecting parts of the eastern Mediterranean during periods associated with widespread social disruption. Lake sediments tell similar stories. Each year, tiny particles settle onto lake bottoms, gradually building layered archives of environmental history. Changes in pollen reveal shifting vegetation. Mineral composition reflects rainfall. Microscopic organisms respond to water chemistry influenced by climate. Together, these natural records provide independent evidence alongside archaeology. Although no single dataset tells the complete story, they increasingly point toward periods of significant environmental instability. Volcanic eruptions introduce another powerful force. Large eruptions inject enormous quantities of sulfur-rich gases into the upper atmosphere. These gases reflect sunlight back into space, temporarily cooling Earth's surface. Modern examples demonstrate that major eruptions can influence global temperatures for several years. Ancient eruptions likely produce similar effects, although reconstructing their precise historical consequences remains difficult. Ice cores extracted from Greenland and Antarctica preserve microscopic volcanic ash and chemical signatures from eruptions occurring thousands of years ago. By comparing these records with archaeological chronologies, researchers investigate whether volcanic activity contributes to particular historical crises. The evidence sometimes aligns remarkably well, yet scholars remain cautious. Dating uncertainties, regional differences, and the complexity of human societies make direct cause and effect relationships difficult to prove. The evidence remains incomplete. No single eruption explains the disappearance of entire civilizations. Earthquakes leave even more visible marks. The eastern Mediterranean sits within one of the world's most active tectonic regions. Major fault systems cross Greece, western Turkey, the Levant and surrounding areas. Throughout history, powerful earthquakes repeatedly damage cities, alter coastlines, trigger landslides, and occasionally generate tsunamis. Archaeologists sometimes identify collapsed walls, displaced foundations, and distinctive destruction patterns, suggesting seismic activity. But distinguishing earthquake damage from warfare or gradual structural failure is not always straightforward. A burned building may indicate invasion. A collapsed wall may result from poor maintenance. A tilted column could reflect either ground movement or centuries of erosion. Careful excavation examines every clue before reaching conclusions. Disease presents an even greater mystery. Unlike earthquakes or volcanic eruptions, epidemics often leave few unmistakable traces in the archaeological record. Mass graves occasionally suggest sudden mortality. Ancient DNA recovered from human remains now allows scientists to identify certain pathogens directly. This rapidly developing field has transformed understanding of several historical outbreaks. For the Bronze Age collapse, however, evidence remains limited. Some researchers propose that infectious disease contributes alongside drought, migration, and conflict. Others argue existing data remain too sparse to support firm conclusions. What survives in the record suggests that disease may have played a role in some regions, but no consensus identifies it as the primary driver. The interaction between these different pressures becomes increasingly important. Consider a farming community already weakened by poor harvests. Malnutrition reduces resistance to illness. Conflict disrupts sanitation. Trade spreads unfamiliar pathogens. Migration introduces populations lacking immunity to certain diseases. None of these factors operates independently. Instead, each strengthens the effects of the others. Modern scientists sometimes describe this as cascading risk. One disturbance creates conditions favorable for another. The sequence becomes more dangerous than any individual event alone. The ancient world offers repeated examples of this principle. A drought encourages migration. Migration increases competition over land. Competition sparks conflict. Conflict interrupts agriculture. Food shortages worsen. Disease spreads among displaced populations. Trade declines. Political authority weakens. The cycle accelerates. Yet even amid these mounting challenges, remarkable resilience continues appearing. Communities diversify crops. Farmers experiment with new cultivation techniques. Settlements relocate closer to dependable water. Merchants establish alternative routes. Metal workers increasingly adopt iron, a material more widely available than tin-dependent bronze. Human ingenuity constantly searches for solutions. Some succeed. Others arrive too late. Perhaps the most striking lesson emerging from modern research is that environmental disasters rarely determine history with mechanical certainty. Two neighboring societies exposed to similar droughts may experience completely different outcomes. Leadership matters. Social cooperation matters. Economic flexibility matters. Technology matters. Simple chance sometimes matters. Nature establishes difficult conditions. Human decisions shape what follows. The disappearance of the old world is therefore neither purely natural nor purely human. It emerges from their continuous interaction. Climate changes. Landscapes evolve. Rivers wander. Mountains shake. Volcanoes erupt. People respond with courage, innovation, conflict, migration, adaptation, and occasionally failure. Together, these forces produce one of history's greatest transformations, not because any single catastrophe overwhelmed civilization, but because countless pressures slowly converge until the familiar world can no longer sustain the institutions built upon it. The land itself has become an active participant in history, quietly guiding humanity toward an age unlike any that came before. The end of one age rarely looks like the beginning of another. Those living through periods of profound change seldom recognize themselves as founders of a new world. They simply rebuild homes after destruction, plant crops in unfamiliar fields, repair broken tools, and teach children how to survive under different conditions. Yet history often reveals that its greatest beginnings emerge from its darkest transitions. As the Bronze Age order dissolves, new societies quietly begin taking shape among its ruins. One of the most important transformations unfolds not through the rise of a mighty empire, but through the growing importance of a different metal. For centuries, bronze dominates nearly every aspect of advanced technology. Stronger than pure copper and relatively reliable, it serves farmers, craftsmen, merchants, and soldiers alike. The difficulty has always been its ingredients. Copper is widespread enough to sustain large industries, but tin remains scarce and unevenly distributed. A civilization dependent upon bronze is therefore also dependent upon long-distance trade. Iron changes that equation. Iron ore exists across much larger portions of the ancient world than economically accessible tin. Although producing workable iron requires higher temperatures and more sophisticated techniques than smelting bronze, successful mastery eventually offers enormous advantages. Communities no longer need to rely upon fragile international networks to acquire essential raw materials. The earliest iron objects appear long before the Bronze Age collapse. Some are fashioned from meteoritic iron, recognizable by its naturally high nickel content. These rare pieces are valued almost like precious stones reserved for ceremonial or elite purposes rather than everyday use. Only gradually do metallurgists learn how to smelt iron from terrestrial ores on a larger scale. This technological transition is slow. Bronze does not disappear overnight. For centuries, bronze and iron coexist. Many early iron tools are not necessarily superior to well-crafted bronze equivalents. In fact, poorly produced iron can be weaker than high-quality bronze. What ultimately changes history is not immediate technological superiority, but the growing availability of iron resources across numerous regions. The collapse of older trade systems unintentionally accelerates this transition. When imported tin becomes increasingly difficult to obtain, experimentation with iron becomes more attractive. Local blacksmiths refine techniques through generations of practice. Furnaces improve. Forging methods become more consistent. Gradually, iron evolves from curiosity into necessity. This shift transforms more than warfare. Farmers gain access to more widely available tools. Woodworkers expand construction possibilities. Communities previously excluded from long-distance bronze trade begin developing local metal industries of their own. Technology becomes less centralized. Meanwhile, political geography also begins changing. The enormous palace kingdoms that dominate the Late Bronze Age give way in many regions to smaller, more flexible states. Some are founded by populations already living there. Others emerge from migrants settling in new territories. Local leaders replace distant imperial administrators. Authority becomes fragmented, but fragmentation also creates opportunities. Along the eastern Mediterranean coast, Phoenician cities flourished during the centuries following the Great Disruptions. Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, and other maritime centres capitalize on their extraordinary seafaring skills. Rather than attempting to rebuild vanished empires, they embrace commerce. Their ships venture farther across the Mediterranean, establishing trading stations and eventually colonies that connect distant shores. Perhaps their greatest gift to history is not wealth, but communication. Building upon earlier writing traditions, Phoenician scribes develop an alphabetic system that dramatically simplifies written language compared with the complex scripts used by many Bronze Age administrations. Instead of memorizing hundreds of symbols, writers can represent speech using a much smaller set of characters. The idea spreads astonishingly far. Adapted by the Greeks and later modified by others, alphabetic writing eventually influences countless modern languages. One of history's most enduring innovations emerges not from the height of imperial power, but from the world rebuilding after collapse. Across the Aegean, Greek communities slowly recover from centuries of decentralization. The Great Mycenaean palace system does not return. Instead, independent settlements evolve in new directions. Population gradually increases. Trade expands once again. Iron tools become more common. Around the 8th century, before the Common Era, writing reappears using an alphabet derived from Phoenician models. The poems later attributed to Homer emerge from this world. Whether the Iliad and the Odyssey preserve distant memories of the Bronze Age remains debated, but they certainly reflect societies looking backward toward a heroic past, while living in a transformed present. Memory survives even when institutions do not. Farther east, powerful new kingdoms rise from the political landscape left behind by earlier empires. The Neo-Assyrian Empire eventually grows into one of the most formidable states of the ancient world. Unlike its predecessors, it develops military, administrative, and logistical systems suited to a different historical environment. Its rulers inherit lessons written in the successes and failures of earlier civilizations. Elsewhere, the kingdoms of Israel and Judah emerge within the Levant. The Neo-Hittite states preserve elements of older Anatolian traditions. The kingdom of Urartu rises in the Armenian highlands. Across the Mediterranean, communities that once occupy only modest settlements begin expanding into influential centers of regional power. History is not restarting, it is reorganizing. Perhaps the most remarkable feature of this new world is its diversity. The old Bronze Age system, although culturally rich, is dominated by a relatively small number of interconnected great powers. The Iron Age becomes more politically fragmented, but also more dynamic. Innovation spreads through competition. Trade resumes along new routes. Technologies circulate through different networks. Cultural exchange continues, though often in altered forms. Archaeology increasingly reveals continuity hidden beneath apparent collapse. Religious sanctuaries remain sacred even when surrounding political systems change. Agricultural terraces continue producing food long after royal administrations disappear. Craft traditions evolve rather than vanish. Families preserve local customs across generations regardless of which kingdom controls the surrounding territory. Scholars still debate the degree to which ordinary people perceive themselves as entering a fundamentally different age. The evidence remains incomplete because written records from many communities are scarce. What survives suggests gradual adaptation rather than sudden awareness. A blacksmith refining iron techniques likely thinks about improving tools, not about inaugurating the Iron Age. A farmer planting barley after several difficult harvests hopes for reliable rain, not historical significance. Yet from the perspective of thousands of years, these practical decisions accumulate into civilizational transformation. The old world does not return. Its coastlines have shifted. Its trade networks have been reconfigured. Its great palaces stand in ruins. Its political map has been redrawn. But its people endure. Their descendants carry forward fragments of ancient knowledge, reshaping them to meet new realities. The disappearance of one world has created the conditions for another, not by erasing the past, but by forcing humanity to imagine different ways of living within a landscape that has permanently changed. Long after cities crumble and kingdoms disappear, stories remain. Stone walls collapse into hillsides, harbours fill with sediment, and forgotten roads vanish beneath forests. Yet memories continue travelling through generations in forms far more difficult to measure than pottery or architecture. A flood becomes the anger of the gods. A migration becomes the journey of a legendary ancestor. The destruction of a kingdom transforms into the tale of a lost golden age. History slowly changes into mythology, carrying fragments of real events across centuries in ways that are both revealing and deceptive. Human beings rarely preserve the past as a perfect record. Instead, memory reshapes experience into narratives that explain the present. Communities ask why familiar landscapes changed, why abandoned ruins stand where no one lives, why seas cover valleys that local traditions insist were once dry land. Why powerful cities exist only as weathered stones. The answers become stories repeated around hearths long before they are written down. Perhaps no theme appears more consistently across ancient cultures than the Great Flood. From Mesopotamia comes the story of Utnapishtim, preserved in the Epic of Gilgamesh, where a catastrophic flood destroys much of humanity before a chosen survivor preserves life aboard a great vessel. In the Hebrew tradition, Noah carries animals through another world-consuming deluge. Greek mythology tells of Deucalion and Pyrrha surviving a flood sent by Zeus. Flood traditions also appear across South Asia, East Asia, the Americas, Oceania, and many other parts of the world. For generations, some writers attempted to explain these similarities by proposing a single global flood remembered identically by all civilizations. Modern scholarship offers a more careful interpretation. Large floods are among the most common natural disasters experienced by agricultural societies. Communities living beside rivers repeatedly witness destructive inundations. Coastal populations observe storm surges and rising seas. Glacial lakes occasionally burst, releasing enormous quantities of water. Different societies can therefore develop flood traditions independently, while still preserving memories of genuine local disasters. This explanation does not diminish the power of these stories. If anything, it makes them more human. Rather than preserving one impossible event, they preserve countless encounters between humanity and water over thousands of years. Some legends may even contain surprisingly ancient echoes. Researchers studying submerged prehistoric landscapes occasionally wonder whether oral traditions preserve distant memories of rising seas after the last ice age. Australia provides one of the most intriguing examples. Several Aboriginal traditions describe coastlines that correspond remarkably well with landscapes submerged thousands of years ago. Some scholars suggest that certain oral histories may preserve memories transmitted across hundreds of generations. Others urge caution, noting that dating oral traditions with precision remains extremely difficult. The evidence remains incomplete. Even so, the possibility demonstrates the extraordinary durability of human memory. In the Eastern Mediterranean, memories of the Bronze Age collapse may also survive in transformed form. The Trojan War, whether rooted in a specific historical conflict or a blend of many events, reflects a world of powerful kings, fortified cities, long-distance alliances, and heroic warfare. Archaeological excavations at Hisarlik, widely identified as the site of ancient Troy, reveal multiple cities built one upon another across centuries. One of these settlements experiences violent destruction during the Late Bronze Age. Scholars continue debating how closely this destruction corresponds to later epic traditions. No single excavation can confirm every detail found in the poems attributed to Homer, yet the broader setting unmistakably reflects memories of a world standing at the edge of profound transformation. The Iliad itself, although written centuries after the events it may partially describe, preserves numerous details more consistent with the Bronze Age than with the era in which it is eventually recorded. Weapons, political relationships, and social customs sometimes appear as fascinating mixtures of older and newer traditions. The poems become bridges between worlds. They remember civilizations already vanished while speaking to audiences living in entirely different societies. Elsewhere, ruins inspire legends of forgotten builders. Massive stone structures survive long after the cultures that construct them disappear. Later populations encountering these monuments naturally seek explanations. Without written records, extraordinary architecture often becomes associated with giants, divine beings, mythical ancestors, or lost civilizations possessing mysterious knowledge. This process repeats throughout history. The impressive walls of Mycenae are later attributed by some Greeks to the Cyclopes, because their immense stones seem beyond ordinary human capability. Across Europe, prehistoric megaliths become linked with legendary heroes, giants, or supernatural powers. In the Andes, monumental ruins inspire traditions connecting them with earlier peoples, whose achievements appear almost beyond imagination. Modern archaeology reveals that ordinary human communities build these structures through remarkable organization, engineering, and persistence, rather than supernatural assistance. Yet the myths themselves remain valuable historical evidence. They demonstrate how later societies interpret inherited landscapes, whose original meanings have faded. Myths also preserve emotional truths even when historical details become transformed. A story about a paradise lost beneath the sea may reflect generations coping with real coastal change. A tale of wandering ancestors may preserve memories of migration. A narrative describing the fall of a mighty kingdom may capture the lived experience of political collapse, even if names and events evolve through centuries of retelling. Memory does not function like a written archive. It preserves significance more faithfully than chronology. Scholars continue debating how much historical information can be extracted directly from mythology. Some researchers emphasize striking correspondences between legends and archaeological discoveries. Others caution against reading myths too literally. Both perspectives contribute important insights. No single explanation fully accounts for the extraordinary persistence of these narratives across so many cultures. Perhaps the greatest lesson lies not in proving whether every story records a specific event, but in recognizing why these stories endure. They remind each generation that no civilization lasts forever. Powerful kingdoms can vanish. Familiar landscapes can change. Prosperous cities can become silent ruins. Yet people survive. They carry memories forward, reshaping them into stories capable of outliving palaces, empires, and even written languages. By the time historians begin carefully recording the ancient past, many of the greatest transformations have already slipped beyond direct observation. What remains are fragments: a burned palace, a submerged forest, an abandoned harbour, a heroic poem, a flood legend, a sacred mountain. Individually, each fragment tells only part of the story. Together they reveal something remarkable. The disappearance of the old world is never entirely forgotten. It echoes through myth, literature, ritual, and memory, reminding later civilizations that beneath every stable society lies a deeper history of change, a history in which every generation inherits a world already shaped by countless disappearances before its own. For much of history, the disappearance of the ancient world seemed almost complete. Travelers walked across empty plains where great cities had once stood, without realizing what lay beneath their feet. Farmers ploughed fields above buried temples. Fishermen cast their nets over drowned forests and forgotten settlements, without suspecting that entire landscapes rested below the waves. The old world had not only vanished, in many places it had become invisible. Only during the past 2 centuries has that hidden world begun slowly returning to view. The rediscovery does not happen through one spectacular breakthrough, but through thousands of careful observations made by archaeologists, geologists, paleoclimatologists, geneticists, linguists, and countless local workers whose patience often proves more valuable than dramatic discoveries. Every excavation starts with uncertainty. A low mound rising gently above surrounding farmland may simply be a natural hill, or it may conceal the accumulated remains of dozens of successive cities built one atop another across thousands of years. Across the Near East, such mounds are known by different names, tells tapes and similar local terms, but they share a remarkable origin. When ancient mud brick buildings collapse, people often rebuild directly upon the ruins. Generation after generation, this cycle slowly raises settlements higher above the surrounding landscape. From a distance, the result appears to be an ordinary hill. Inside lies an archive of human history. Excavating such a site requires extraordinary patience. Unlike treasure hunters of earlier centuries, modern archaeologists rarely dig quickly. Instead, they remove soil layer by layer, documenting every wall pottery fragment, seed, animal bone, hearth, and post hole with meticulous care. A single square meter may require days of work. The goal is not simply to recover objects, but to understand relationships. Which building comes first? Which fire occurs before another? Which wall cuts through an earlier structure? History emerges not from isolated artifacts but from their context. One broken clay bowl may reveal little. Its position within a carefully dated layer beside burned grain, collapsed timber, and domestic tools can illuminate an entire chapter of human experience. This emphasis on context has revolutionized archaeology. During the 19th century, many excavations focused primarily on recovering beautiful sculptures, inscriptions, and precious objects from museums. While these discoveries remain important, countless details about ordinary life are often lost forever because excavation methods are insufficiently systematic. Modern archaeology treats every fragment as potential evidence. Charred seeds reveal ancient crops. Animal bones indicate diet and livestock management. Tiny fish vertebrae demonstrate seasonal fishing practices. Microscopic pollen grains preserve surrounding vegetation. Even discarded garbage becomes historically valuable. Some of the greatest breakthroughs come not from architecture but from materials almost too small to notice. Pollen preserved within lake sediments allows researchers to reconstruct ancient forests with astonishing precision. Each species of plant produces distinctive pollen grains that survive for thousands of years under favorable conditions. By examining changing pollen layers, scientists observe forests giving way to grasslands, wetlands expanding or shrinking, and agriculture gradually replacing natural vegetation. The landscape itself begins telling its own story. Tree rings add another remarkable source of evidence. Living trees preserve timber and ancient wooden structures together, create overlapping sequences extending back thousands of years in certain regions. This science, known as dendrochronology, allows researchers not only to date wooden objects, but also to reconstruct annual patterns of rainfall and temperature. A narrow ring may record a difficult growing season. Several consecutive narrow rings may reveal prolonged drought. When compared with archaeological evidence, these natural records illuminate environmental conditions experienced by ancient communities. Beneath the oceans, an entirely different archive waits. Marine archaeology has transformed understanding of vanished coastlines and forgotten trade routes. Advances in sonar mapping, underwater robotics, and satellite navigation now allow researchers to identify submerged river valleys, harbour installations, shipwrecks, and even prehistoric settlements hidden beneath meters of water. The North Sea provides one of the most extraordinary examples. The drowned landscape of Doggerland, once almost unimaginable, is gradually reconstructed using seismic surveys originally conducted for offshore energy exploration. These surveys reveal ancient river systems winding beneath the seabed with astonishing clarity. Former lake basins, hills and valleys appear where modern maps show only open water. Fishing vessels continue recovering bones of mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, deer, and occasionally human-made tools from these submerged sediments. Each discovery strengthens the picture of a thriving landscape gradually consumed by rising seas. Space technology now contributes as well. Satellites orbiting hundreds of kilometers above Earth detect subtle differences in vegetation, soil moisture, and topography, invisible from ground level. Buried walls influence how crops grow above them. Ancient canals leave faint marks detectable only under particular lighting conditions. Infrared imagery reveals forgotten roads crossing deserts where no visible traces remain. In Egypt, the Middle East, Central Asia, and the Americas, satellite archaeology has identified thousands of previously unknown sites. Entire settlement networks emerge from what once appears to be empty landscape. Perhaps the most revolutionary development of all comes from ancient DNA. Until recently, archaeologists could study skeletons primarily through their physical characteristics. Now, microscopic fragments of preserved genetic material reveal family relationships, migrations, disease, histories, and population movements impossible to detect through traditional methods alone. The results have reshaped understanding of prehistoric Europe, Western Asia, and many other regions. Communities once assumed to be isolated are shown to possess surprisingly complex genetic connections extending across continents. Migration appears far more common than earlier generations imagine. Yet genetics also demonstrates continuity. Many populations survive enormous historical upheavals rather than disappearing entirely. Their descendants continue living in transformed societies carrying fragments of much older ancestry. Scholars still debate exactly how to integrate genetic evidence with archaeology and linguistics, because each discipline reveals different aspects of the past. DNA identifies biological relationships, artifacts reveal cultural practices, languages trace communication and identity. No single source provides complete answers. Together, however, they create an increasingly detailed picture. Perhaps the greatest lesson emerging from these discoveries is humility. The old world proves vastly more complicated than anyone previously suspects. Civilizations rarely vanish completely. Landscapes rarely remain unchanged. Simple historical narratives dissolve beneath growing evidence. Instead of clear endings, researchers find transitions. Instead of isolated cultures, they uncover interconnected networks. Instead of single catastrophes, they reveal centuries of overlapping environmental, political, technological, and social change. The ancient world has not truly returned. Much remains buried beneath cities, forests, deserts, and oceans. Countless sites have undoubtedly been lost forever through erosion construction, or the simple passage of time. The evidence will always remain incomplete, yet with every excavation, every sediment core, every satellite image, and every newly sequenced fragment of ancient DNA, another small piece of the disappearing world rises once more into human memory. The more evidence emerges from buried cities, drowned coastlines, ancient DNA, and climate records, the more one uncomfortable truth becomes impossible to ignore. There is no single key that unlocks the disappearance of the old world. Every generation of scholars has hoped to discover one decisive explanation: a great invasion, a devastating drought, a catastrophic earthquake, a mysterious plague, or a single political failure capable of explaining everything. Instead, every new discovery reveals a world that is even more interconnected and more complicated than previously imagined. For much of the 20th century, historical explanations often favored dramatic simplicity. A civilization disappeared because it was conquered. A city burned because an invading army destroyed it. An empire collapsed because a weak king inherited the throne. Such explanations possessed obvious appeal. They were easy to understand. They offered clear causes and clear consequences. Modern archaeology has steadily challenged this approach. When researchers compare destruction layers from dozens of ancient sites, the chronology rarely aligns perfectly. Some cities are abandoned decades before neighboring kingdoms begin declining. Others continue flourishing long after nearby capitals have fallen. Certain regions experience little evidence of violent destruction at all. If a single invading force truly caused the collapse of an entire world, the archaeological record should appear much more uniform than it actually does. Instead, the evidence resembles a patchwork. Some settlements burn, others shrink gradually, still others relocate peacefully. The variety itself becomes an important clue. Climate has emerged as another powerful explanation, particularly as paleoclimate research has become increasingly sophisticated. Tree rings, cave formations, lake sediments, and pollen records all indicate that several regions experienced prolonged periods of environmental stress around the end of the Bronze Age. Reduced rainfall would naturally threaten agriculture, encourage migration, and weaken political stability. Few scholars now doubt that climate contributes significantly to the wider transformation. The debate concerns how much weight climate deserves compared with other factors. Some researchers argue that prolonged drought initiates a chain reaction, affecting every aspect of society. Others caution against granting climate too much agency. Human communities often survive difficult environmental conditions when political institutions remain flexible. Likewise, prosperous civilizations sometimes collapse even without severe climatic disruption. The evidence suggests interaction rather than domination. Environmental pressure increases vulnerability. Human choices determine much of what follows. The Sea Peoples remain among the most debated subjects in ancient history. Egyptian inscriptions clearly describe conflicts involving groups arriving from across the sea. Archaeology confirms widespread disruption affecting many coastal regions. Yet the precise identity of these groups continues provoking discussion. Were they displaced farmers fleeing famine, experienced sailors seeking new homelands, mercenary forces serving collapsing kingdoms before turning against former employers, confederations formed from multiple migrant communities? The surviving evidence refuses to provide one definitive answer. Modern scholars increasingly view the Sea Peoples less as a mysterious civilization and more as participants within a broader period of instability. They are not necessarily the beginning of the crisis. They may instead be one of its consequences. Migration itself deserves careful attention. Earlier historical writing sometimes portrays migrating populations as overwhelming waves, replacing earlier inhabitants almost overnight. Ancient DNA and archaeology now suggest more complicated realities. Many migrations occur gradually. Communities intermarry. Cultures blend. Technologies spread independently of large population movements. Some regions receive newcomers while maintaining substantial continuity among existing populations. Others experience more dramatic demographic change. There is no universal pattern. Economic explanations add another layer. Complex palace economies depend upon efficient administration, reliable taxation, secure transportation, specialized labor, and international exchange. These systems generate extraordinary prosperity when functioning well. They also possess hidden fragility. Modern economists sometimes describe similar arrangements as highly optimized. Efficiency increases productivity. It may also reduce resilience. If every part of a system depends upon every other part operating successfully, multiple simultaneous disruptions become extremely difficult to absorb. This concept has attracted growing interest among historians studying ancient collapse. Rather than asking which single event destroys civilization, they ask how numerous moderate problems combine into overwhelming crises. A drought reduces harvests. Smaller harvests reduce tax revenues. Lower revenues weaken military protection. Reduced security discourages merchants. Declining trade limits access to essential materials. Political instability increases. Migration accelerates. Conflict expands. Each individual problem remains survivable. Together they exceed the system's capacity to respond. This system's perspective increasingly dominates current scholarship because it accommodates the complexity visible within archaeological evidence. Even so, important disagreements remain. Chronology presents one persistent challenge. Dating ancient events with complete precision is remarkably difficult. Radiocarbon dating provides estimated ranges rather than exact calendar years. Different laboratories occasionally produce slightly different results. Historical records vary in reliability. One kingdom's chronology may not align perfectly with another's. These uncertainties matter because establishing whether one event precedes another influences interpretations of cause and effect. Scholars therefore continue refining timelines using increasingly sophisticated methods. Language also complicates interpretation. Many surviving texts are political documents produced by ruling elites. Kings naturally portray themselves as victorious. Failures may be minimized. Enemies may be exaggerated. Natural disasters may be interpreted as divine punishment rather than environmental processes. Reading these sources requires constant awareness of their purposes. Archaeology sometimes confirms written accounts. Sometimes it contradicts them. Often it adds entirely new perspectives. Popular culture occasionally introduces still more speculative explanations. Stories of vanished super-civilizations, advanced lost technologies, or mysterious forgotten continents continue attracting enormous public interest. Such ideas possess undeniable imaginative appeal. However, mainstream archaeological evidence does not support claims that advanced global civilizations disappear without leaving appropriate material traces. The remarkable achievements of ancient societies become no less impressive because they are entirely human. The pyramids, Bronze Age trade networks, sophisticated irrigation systems, monumental temples, and carefully planned cities require no forgotten super technology. They require organization, accumulated knowledge, skilled labor, and generations of persistence. Reality proves extraordinary enough on its own. Perhaps the most important conclusion emerging from decades of research is that uncertainty is not weakness. Science advances by recognizing the limits of current evidence. Scholars openly acknowledge where debates continue. New excavations regularly overturn older assumptions. Fresh discoveries force revisions to long-accepted theories. The disappearance of the Old World remains one of history's greatest puzzles, precisely because researchers refuse to settle for overly simple answers. Every buried city uncovered, every climate record recovered, every ancient genome sequenced, every forgotten harbour mapped beneath the sea. Each contributes another fragment without completing the entire picture. The Old World continues revealing itself, slowly encouraging patience rather than certainty. Its disappearance is no longer understood as one dramatic catastrophe. Instead, it stands as one of humanity's most intricate historical transformations, a reminder that civilizations are shaped not by isolated events, but by the continuous interaction of environment, technology, economy, politics, migration, memory, and countless individual human decisions unfolding across generations. If someone could stand upon a hill overlooking the eastern Mediterranean around 1,000 years before the Common Era, the view would appear strangely familiar and completely transformed at the same time. The mountains would still rise where they always had. Rivers would continue flowing toward the sea. Olive trees would cling to rocky slopes, and fishing boats would still venture from sheltered coves before dawn. Yet almost every human institution shaping that landscape would be different from the one that existed only a few centuries earlier. The Old World has disappeared, not because humanity has vanished, not because civilization has ended, but because nearly every structure through which people understand their place within the world has been quietly rewritten. The great palace kingdoms that once dominate international politics no longer command vast networks of tribute stretching across continents. Instead, a mosaic of smaller kingdoms, independent cities, tribal confederations, merchant republics, and emerging states occupies the political landscape. Power has become more decentralized. In some places, this fragmentation produces instability. In others, it encourages remarkable innovation. The Mediterranean itself begins changing character. During the Bronze Age, much of its long-distance commerce depends upon royal administrations negotiating with one another through formal diplomatic systems. In the centuries that follow, maritime trade increasingly falls into the hands of highly adaptable merchant communities. Phoenician sailors become masters of this changing sea. Their ships travel westward beyond familiar routes, establishing commercial settlements across Cyprus, Sicily, Sardinia, North Africa, southern Iberia, and eventually far beyond the traditional centres of Bronze Age power. Among those colonies, one will later become one of history's greatest cities. Carthage begins as a Phoenician settlement. Generations later, it grows into a maritime empire whose influence rivals that of Rome itself. Its existence demonstrates that collapse does not erase opportunity. It redistributes it. Elsewhere, the scattered Greek communities emerging from the centuries following the collapse gradually reconnect with one another. Population expands. Agriculture improves. Iron tools become increasingly common. Trade revives. Independent city-states begin developing distinctive political traditions, unlike the centralized palace administrations of the Mycenaean era. Athens, Sparta, Corinth, and many others remain relatively modest settlements for now, yet the foundations of classical Greece are quietly being laid. The same pattern appears repeatedly across the ancient world. The Neo-Assyrian Empire develops administrative techniques allowing it to govern territories far larger than many earlier kingdoms. Its rulers construct roads, organize provincial governments, maintain sophisticated communication networks, and build one of the most formidable military systems of the ancient age. They inherit lessons from civilizations that came before, even while creating something fundamentally new. Technology continues evolving as well. Ironworking spreads across broader regions. Blacksmiths refine techniques through generations of experimentation. Tools become increasingly accessible to communities previously dependent upon imported bronze. Agriculture benefits. Construction benefits. Craft production expands. The technological foundation of the old world has changed permanently, yet continuity quietly persists beneath visible transformation. Farmers continue cultivating wheat and barley in valleys first planted thousands of years earlier. Olive groves survive political revolutions. Ancient irrigation canals remain in use long after the kingdoms that construct them disappear. Sacred sites continue attracting worshippers despite changing religions and governments. Languages evolve gradually rather than vanishing overnight. Every civilization inherits more from its predecessors than it initially realizes. Even monumental ruins become active participants in history. Later generations quarry stone from abandoned palaces to build new temples, fortifications, and homes. Ancient roads remain useful centuries after the empires maintaining them disappear. Harbours established by forgotten kingdoms continue serving merchants speaking entirely different languages. The past literally becomes the foundation upon which the future is constructed. Archaeologists frequently observe this layering during excavation. A Roman building incorporates stones taken from an earlier Greek sanctuary. Beneath that sanctuary lies a Bronze Age settlement. Below it rests a Neolithic village. Human history resembles less a sequence of separate worlds than an ever-growing conversation between generations. Each age builds upon what survives from those before it. Some inherit magnificent monuments, others inherit caution. The memory of collapse itself becomes part of civilization's cultural inheritance. Communities that have experienced famine construct larger storage facilities. Kingdoms remembering invasion strengthen defensive walls. Merchants diversify trade routes after witnessing earlier disruptions. Political institutions evolve partly in response to past failures. History becomes teacher as much as record. Modern societies often imagine themselves fundamentally different from the ancient world. In many respects, they certainly are. Science has transformed understanding of climate, disease, geology, astronomy, and countless other subjects. Industrial technology has altered economies beyond anything ancient peoples could imagine. Global communication links continents almost instantly. Yet beneath these differences lie familiar patterns. Modern civilization also depends upon interconnected trade. Food still relies upon stable environmental conditions. Complex economies remain vulnerable to disruptions affecting transportation, energy, or climate. Large urban populations require continuous supplies of water, food, and raw materials. The lessons preserved within the disappearance of the old world therefore remain surprisingly relevant. Not because history repeats exactly. It never does. Rather, history demonstrates recurring principles. Complex societies flourish when flexibility accompanies prosperity. They become vulnerable when efficiency replaces resilience. Environmental change matters. Political decisions matter. Technology matters. Human cooperation matters. None alone determines destiny. Together they shape it. Scholars continue uncovering new evidence each year. Fresh excavations reveal unknown settlements. Ancient DNA refines migration histories. Improved climate records clarify environmental conditions. Satellite surveys identify forgotten landscapes hidden beneath deserts and forests. The story remains unfinished. Every discovery reminds researchers that the ancient world still holds countless secrets beneath its soil. Perhaps somewhere beneath the modern city lies another archive waiting to transform understanding of the Bronze Age. Perhaps another shipwreck rests beneath Mediterranean waters carrying letters from kingdoms whose names have been lost. Perhaps submerged coastlines still conceal villages preserving entirely new chapters of human history. The disappearance of the old world is therefore not merely an event confined to the distant past. It is an ongoing investigation. Every generation asks new questions. Every generation uncovers different answers. And every answer reveals that the civilizations which seem to vanish completely never truly disappear. They remain present in languages, technologies, traditions, landscapes, and memories woven invisibly into the foundations of every world that follows. There is a quiet moment that arrives after every great transformation. The fires have burned themselves out. The refugees have found new homes or have disappeared into unfamiliar landscapes. The victorious armies, if there were any, have returned to lives shaped by the same uncertain climate as those they defeated. Children are born into a world that feels perfectly ordinary to them, even though their grandparents would scarcely recognize it. The disappearance of the old world is complete, not when its last city falls, but when a new generation no longer remembers that another world once existed. This is perhaps the greatest mystery surrounding the ancient past. History often measures collapse through dramatic events. A palace destroyed a kingdom, conquered a famous ruler overthrown. Yet civilizations truly end when memory itself begins to change. The farmer ploughing a field beside the ruins of an abandoned fortress may know nothing about the dynasty that built it. A shepherd guiding flocks through a deserted valley may treat fallen columns simply as convenient landmarks. Children play among broken walls without realizing they're climbing over the remains of libraries, workshops, temples, and homes that once formed the heart of thriving societies. Ruins slowly lose their names. Names disappear before stones do. Across the Mediterranean, the Near East, and beyond, countless ancient settlements experience exactly this fate. Some survive as modest villages occupying only a fraction of their former size. Others become sacred places whose original purpose is forgotten. Many vanish beneath wind-blown sand river sediment forests or expanding towns. Nature proves remarkably patient. Roots slowly push apart carefully fitted masonry. Floods deposit fresh layers of silt over abandoned streets. Wind fills empty buildings with drifting sand. Birds nest where kings once received ambassadors. Foxes and wolves wander through gates once guarded by elite soldiers. Within only a few centuries, landscapes begin reclaiming what humanity temporarily borrowed. Yet humanity also possesses its own remarkable patience. Again and again, people return to these forgotten places, not always to restore them. Sometimes merely to reuse the stone. Ancient blocks become foundations for newer homes. Temple columns support later churches or mosques. Bronze objects are melted and reshaped. Roads laid by vanished civilizations continue guiding travelers long after the governments maintaining them disappear. Nothing is ever entirely lost. It simply changes purpose. This continuity becomes one of the defining characteristics of civilization itself. Ancient Egypt inherits ideas from prehistoric communities living along the Nile. The Greeks absorb influences from Egypt, Anatolia, Phoenicia, and Mesopotamia. The Romans learn from the Greeks while adapting countless earlier traditions to their own expanding world. Later civilizations preserve Roman roads, legal concepts, engineering principles, and urban planning. The chain stretches forward across thousands of years. Every society believes it is creating something new. Every society is also carrying fragments of worlds already gone. Even language preserves these invisible inheritances. Words survive long after the cultures creating them have disappeared. Agricultural practices outlive kingdoms. Navigation techniques endure beyond the ports where they're first developed. Religious symbols evolve into new meanings while retaining echoes of older beliefs. Music stories, crafts, architecture, and seasonal customs often travel across astonishing spans of time. The old world never truly vanishes. It dissolves into everything that follows. Modern science has strengthened this realization in unexpected ways. Ancient DNA reveals that populations rarely disappear as completely as earlier historians imagined. Archaeology shows continuity beneath apparent destruction. Climate research demonstrates that environmental change unfolds over generations rather than dramatic moments. Geology reminds us that coastlines themselves are temporary. Every discipline points toward the same conclusion. The disappearance of the old world is not a single ending. It is a long process of transformation. Scholars still debate many details. Exactly how severe were particular droughts? How quickly did migrations unfold? Which cities fell because of warfare and which because of economic decline? How much influence did earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, or disease exert? The evidence will probably never answer every question. Some settlements now lie beneath modern cities where excavation is impossible. Others rest beneath deep ocean sediments. Countless wooden structures have long since decayed. Written records have turned to dust. The historical picture will always contain gaps, yet those gaps themselves carry meaning. They remind us that history is not a completed book waiting to be read. It is an ongoing conversation between evidence and imagination, constrained by careful scholarship, yet continually enriched by new discoveries. Every excavation uncovers another forgotten neighborhood. Every satellite survey reveals another buried road. Every sediment core extends another climate record. Every ancient genome adds another voice to humanity's shared story. Perhaps the greatest lesson left by the disappearing old world is neither fear nor nostalgia. It is perspective. The civilizations that seem eternal while they flourish eventually become subjects of archaeology. The coastlines that appear permanent slowly migrate. The deserts once bloom with lakes. The fertile valleys sometimes become dry plains. Human history unfolds within a planet that has never stopped changing. The people who lived through these transformations rarely understood their full significance. Neither do we. Future generations may look back upon our own age with the same mixture of admiration, curiosity and surprise that we now direct toward the Bronze Age, the first cities, and the drowned landscapes beneath today's seas. The old world disappeared. Humanity did not. Instead, it adapted, remembered, imperfectly forgot, selectively rebuilt patiently, and carried enough of its past into the future that traces of those vanished civilizations still shape the modern world in ways most people never notice. The story, in truth, never ended. It simply became our own. The evening settles over landscapes that have witnessed more change than any single generation could ever imagine. The rivers continue flowing toward the sea, although not always through the same channels. Waves roll across coastlines that have shifted countless times since the first people stood watching the horizon. Beneath those waters rest forests where birds once nested, valleys where children once played, and villages whose names disappeared thousands of years before the first historians tried to preserve them. The ruins scattered across deserts, mountains, and fields no longer speak with the voices of kings. They speak with quieter truths. They remind us that permanence has always been one of humanity's most comforting illusions. Every city, no matter how magnificent, exists only for a moment within the vast rhythm of geological time. Every civilization borrows its place from landscapes that are themselves continually changing. Yet disappearance is never the whole story. The people of the old world leave more than broken walls behind. They leave seeds that become future harvests. They leave roads that guide later travelers. They leave stories that survive long after the names of their authors have faded. They leave ideas carried invisibly through language, craftsmanship, memory, and tradition. Generation after generation receives these quiet inheritances without always knowing where they began. Perhaps that is the gentlest way to understand the ancient past, not as a sequence of worlds that vanish forever, but as an endless unfolding in which every ending quietly prepares another beginning. The landscapes change, the coastlines move, kingdoms rise and fall. But humanity continues walking forward, carrying fragments of forgotten ages into futures those earlier people could never imagine. And somewhere beneath the soil, beneath the forests, beneath the deserts, and beneath the sea, the old world still waits patiently, not lost, only sleeping, ready to reveal another small piece of its story whenever careful hands uncover it once more.